My name is Leyla Mavi. I'm a student assistant at the German Center of Gerontology. I currently study at German Center of Gerontology, and I currently study psychology, and I will present results of my master thesis. So my master thesis is on historical change in self-esteem. Self-esteem is an individual resource and refers to how individuals evaluate their value and worth, and it is important for different life domains, including relationships, mental and physical health, antisocial behavior, and it's also considered important in the context of successful aging. I will address this more in detail later. I will also look at historical change in self-esteem development in the second half of life. Previous research shows that self-esteem follows, or the development of self-esteem follows a curvilinear trend. So we see this increase in self-esteem in midlife, and then a peak at around 60, and a decline in self-esteem in older ages. And then there are commonly gender differences observed for self-esteem, with men reporting higher self-esteem than women. So again, the objective of my thesis was historical change in self-esteem. There is some literature on this, but it's more inconclusive with mixed results, and most of these studies were conducted on US samples and cover younger age ranges, and therefore I focused on middle-aged and older adults in Germany. So I relied my hypotheses or my research question on a theoretical model which addresses how historical changes in different layers affect adult development. And in my case, self-esteem, and I addressed 3 research questions. How does self-esteem change across historical time, so regarding the level? Then how does self-esteem development change across historical time? And lastly, do gender differences in self-esteem shift across cohorts? As mentioned above, so I relied my background on a theoretical model, and they address how there are different layers or dimensions that change across historical time, for example, individual resources or social embedding. And relevant for self-esteem, there is research on historical change in physical functioning, social relationships, control beliefs, and also changes in the zeitgeist, including individualization. And based on these developments, I proposed 2 hypotheses. Most importantly, these changes in these different domains are positive in most of the cases, and therefore I expected later born cohorts to report higher levels of self-esteem compared to earlier born cohorts, and I expected also more favorable self-esteem development in the second half of life, meaning that later born cohorts should report steeper increases in self-esteem in midlife and less pronounced self-esteem declines in old age. And lastly, men usually report higher self-esteem than women. However, there are also historical changes in the workforce, particularly women increasingly participate in paid labor, and this goes along with different individual resources, particularly for women, including historical increases in women's assertiveness, and dominance, as well as more favorable control beliefs. These are all individual resources related to self-esteem, and therefore I expected gender differences in self-esteem to be smaller in later born cohorts compared to earlier born cohorts. My analysis is based on the German Aging Survey, which is a cohort sequential longitudinal data set of middle-aged and older adults in Germany. I used different assessment waves from 2002 to 2017, and my participants were in the second half of life, ranging from 44 to 83 years old. And the final analysis is based on approximately 12,000 participants, and I conducted multi-level modeling to address my research questions. Here you can see self-esteem development in the second half of life. I could replicate previous results, so I also found this curvilinear trend. First, there's this slight increase in self-esteem in midlife, and then a more pronounced decline in self-esteem in older ages. Contrary to my predictions, actually later bone cohorts reported lower levels of self-esteem than earlier bone cohorts, so my first hypothesis was not met, and I predicted the opposite, and I couldn't find cohort differences in the aging trajectory of self-esteem, and this is also illustrated here, so the trajectories only differ in the level but not in the shape of the slope. And lastly, and very surprisingly, I found that women reported higher self-esteem than men. Both women and men reported historical declines in self-esteem to the same extent, so gender differences in self-esteem did not change across historical time, with the exception that women reported higher self-esteem than men. So hypothesis 3 was not confirmed either. Here's a summary of my results. I will address this again. So none of my hypotheses were met. So surprisingly, I found historical declines in self-esteem despite historical improvements in other areas of functioning, like physical functioning or control beliefs. So it is unclear why I found these negative core trends. One explanation might be that earlier bone cohorts experienced major adversity due to World War II and economic depression, but later in their lives actually experienced improved living standards and therefore might evaluate their lives and also their self-esteem more favorable. And there's another study with a similar range of birth years on life satisfaction, and they found also historical declines in life satisfaction and brought up this explanation. Then another explanation might be individualization. So I actually expected that individualization would improve self-esteem because in an individualized context, individuals are required to be really self-responsible for their life decisions, and therefore self-esteem is an important resource to master all these challenges. But actually, in the process of individualization, traditional institutions like family or religion become less important and provide less clear reference standards for how to evaluate oneself. So this might also be an explanation. And lastly, there's some research pointing towards historical decline in marital quality and relationship satisfaction, which might also contribute to this negative cohort trend. And regarding gender differences, I found these reverse gender differences in favor of women. Most of the research suggests the opposite, but there are studies that find gender differences are moderated by other factors and vary by age, culture, or broader macro-level indicators, and also in some age ranges, specifically in older ages, some studies find no gender differences in self-esteem at all. So there seem to be other factors involved in this relationship, and they might also explain, at least to some extent, higher levels of self-esteem among women in this sample. But of course, this needs to be replicated and tested whether this is a DEA-specific finding or the German-specific finding. And then regarding historical change, both women and men reported these declines across cohorts to the same extent, and it is unclear now whether these results reflect historical changes that are not gender-specific, like adversity experienced due to World War II. These are not really gender specific and might therefore affect women and men similarly, but it could also be that gender specific mechanisms underlie historical declines in women versus men. And I think this is probably also most interesting for future research because I didn't empirically test these covariates and these possible explanatory factors to actually address them and to test empirically whether they can account for the cohort effects. And here's a summary. So I observed these historical declines in self-esteem among middle-aged and older adults in Germany, even though we see improvements in other areas of life. Of course, this needs to be replicated because it also differs from maybe results in the United States. And I think it's also very interesting to consider this in the context of successful aging, because primarily biomedical constructs are considered when looking at successful aging, but also subjective indicators, well-being indicators need to be considered, and self-esteem is one of them. And I think most importantly, we know very little about the underlying mechanisms in historical change, so these should be addressed empirically in future research. So thank you for listening. I'm very interested in your thoughts or questions.